Welcome to the AFCEA Leadership Forum 5-Question Series. I'm Bob Ackerman, the Editor-in-Chief of Signal Magazine. Today we welcome Jill Tummler Singer, former Federal Chief Information Officer. Currently a partner at Deepwater Point and the Chief Executive Officer of Tummler Singer Associates, LLC, Jill recently completed 27 years of federal service. This included assignments as Chief Information Officer for the National Reconnaissance Office, Deputy Chief Information Officer at the Central Intelligence Agency, and Director for the Diplomatic Telecommunications Service for the U.S. State Department. Now she advises clients on transformation, strategy, leadership, and technology. An outside director and advisory board member to several companies operating in the intelligence and defense arenas, Jill also serves as an executive on grounds for the University of Virginia's McIntire School of Commerce. And she is co-chair of the AFCEA International Cyber Committee. Jill, welcome again to AFCEA, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, Bob, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
You've had a diverse background in government and industry, so let me ask you, what would you say are the characteristics in an individual that mark that person as a potential leader?
Well, that's a great question, Bob, and I think that it's one that we always look to try and discover. I will just settle on 5 characteristics that I believe make a strong leader. The first one I would say is the ability to set a vision and to create a strategic path forward for an organization to achieve the vision. That probably looks like actions codified in goals and objectives, but it really is the first thing is being able to tell the workforce, here's where we're going to go, and here's actually how we're going to get there. The second thing that I would say is the ability to rally the team and to change the culture. In order to be a really effective leader, you have to make sure that the team around you can be excited about your vision and that you can actually get them pumped up to go achieve that vision. Along the way, we often face struggles in an organization that look like culture change. And so a good, effective leader often spends as much time on changing the culture of the organization as they do on trying to set the business vision for the organization. I think a third thing that an effective leader does is take heat for the team. Whenever you are in an organizational environment, there will be skeptics, there will be cynics, there will be those who don't like where you're trying to go. And in order to protect the actual team doing the work, the leader has to stand up and be that shield. I think the fourth thing I would say is a good leader always, repeatedly, connects their vision and where they're trying to go to reasons for mission success or for business outcomes. Setting a vision just because it's a cool, interesting place to go from a technology perspective is irrelevant. Setting a vision that may include a technology because it will make your business more competitive in the future or it will give you mission advantage is relevant. And I think the strong leader always makes those connections, not only for their team, but for the teams around them. And then I would say the last characteristic of a really good leader is charisma and communication. I'll put them together. It is to rally the troops and to convince others that where you're trying to take the organization is the right place to go, often requires a whole heck of a lot of charisma and certainly requires constant communication in writing form or in oral form to make sure that you are telling everyone over and over again. What's that saying? Tell them what you want them to know. Tell them again what you want them to know, and then repeat it and summarize it at the end of what you want them to know. And I find that really effective leaders combine that ability to communicate in a very positive way using charisma.
You've described those 5 characteristics. What is the most important skill for a leader to have?
I'll probably be wrong here, or certainly someone will think that I am wrong here, so I'm just going to give you my opinion. And I couldn't come up with just one. I had to settle on 2, so please, if you'll indulge me. Mm-hmm. The first one that I would say is really the ability to set that vision and to actually define the way to get from where an organization is today to where the vision takes them on a step-by-step manner so that it is believable by the organization and can be achieved is number one. And that's the difference, I think, between leadership and management. For the leader, they're really trying to take you somewhere. Most of the best organizations we have around us today didn't get there by flying by the seat of their pants. They got there because they had a leader who could see a vision, sometimes many, many years into the future, And that leader could also articulate how you get from where you are to where you want to be. So I'd say that's number one. And I would say the second skill is humility. Because you're often peering into the future and you're trying to take an organization somewhere, you're going to be wrong at times. And the most effective leader will realize that they're wrong because actually part of their vision or part of their path to achieving the vision was incorrect, or they'll be wrong because the environment around them changed. And that makes their vision incorrect. But the most effective leader is the one who recognizes that, acknowledges that, admits that, and then changes course in order to respond to either a technology change, an environment change, or an organizational change. The worst that could happen to a leader is to not recognize when a change has occurred, and they stay on a course that they are determined to stay on without veering from, and it ends up to be a disastrous consequence for an organization.
I think most people would agree with that. But how do you combine that confidence and that humility?
You know, it may seem like a delicate balance, but I believe that if you constantly demonstrate humility, then it is easy to also show the confidence. By that, let me give you an example. I have a tendency to think and speak simultaneously. Anyone who's ever worked for me has heard me in a meeting say, I'm going to think out loud, which means I reserve the right to be wrong in my thinking. So that makes you just like anybody else, but you're willing to take that risk of saying what's on your mind, even though it might not be perfectly thought or perfectly planned. And I have, in my experiences, found that the employees around me appreciate that because they know that every word out of my mouth isn't a dictate. They know that sometimes it is allowing everyone to be engaged in the collaborative process of thinking through a future. Now, if you are always wrong every time you open your mouth and have a thought, that certainly doesn't engender confidence in your workforce. So it's a balance there, but it is one that I believe good leaders can easily achieve.
Well, if you're always wrong, you're not going to be a leader for much longer.
If ever. Yes.
But let's talk about leadership style. When do you know your leadership style is working? What are the indicators?
I think some of the indicators that would be around you to know that your leadership style might be working, I'll say it that way, might be working, is when you hear your words echoed by your workforce. When you are in a different setting or you're in a briefing and it's one of your employees or one of your colleagues who is up there briefing and they say something back that you've already said before, that might be an indicator that your leadership style is working. I think another indicator that it might be working is when the organization around you changes the conversation from why are you doing this to are you sure that's the best way to do this? Because that represents a fundamental acceptance of what you're trying to do. Now they want to argue about how you're going to do it. I would take that argument any day because there are probably 5 good ways to get something done. But if you can't get them off of the why, then you never get to the how. And so once you get to the how, I think that's another indicator that you might be successful at what you're trying to achieve. I have a couple more. I'd also say that an example is your ability to fill an auditorium. If you have something that you want to say and you're a leader of an organization and you call an all hands or you call a group together and you can fill an auditorium, that is an indicator that your leadership might be working because people actually want to hear what you have to say. If you're a leader and you call an all hands and your auditorium is empty, that's an indicator. Probably not of strong leadership or strong vision, but it certainly is an indicator. And then I think the last thing I would say, there are lots of survey instruments that organizations use to help you confirm that you're on the right path or you're not. For example, I'm most familiar with employee engagement surveys. And if the trends, generally they're year over year, so you have to wait a while, but if the trends are up and your employee workforce is more and more engaged, there's probably something in the leadership that's working.
No one is 100% successful. Every leader will have a failure at some point or another. I'm going to put you on the spot here and ask you, what would you say was your greatest failure and what did you learn from it?
Let's see how the humility works now. You know what, I would venture to say that any truly risky leader and any truly visionary leader has had way more than one failure and way more than one probably great failure. And I believe that I've had many along the way. I had to give some thought. I had the opportunity to think about what the greatest failure was. And the story I'm going to tell you is one where I learned a lot and I matured a lot as a leader. I had, in one of the organizations that I ran, I had the need from some of our constituents to provide a backup satellite capability to the embassies and the consulates around the world. I liked the idea. I supported the idea. I actually thought that it would be good for the country to have additional capabilities. But I didn't have all positive constituent voices. I had a fair amount of negative constituents who were worried about the cost and who were worried about the long-term implications on their budgets of providing such a new capability across the globe. I was so convinced that the national security need was there that I sort of ramrodded it through. We did a contract acquisition in record time. It was probably the funding wasn't as tight as we should have made it, the ROI and so forth, and the ability to pay for it 10 years later, not as tight as we needed it to be. And in the end, I alienated a huge set of users and put a program at risk. What did we have to do to overcome that? We actually had to go back and restructure the program, change the focus, narrow the focus, close the gap in the funding, and make a little bit of progress, but a lot less progress than I had initially intended. One of the mantras that I have used many times since then is think big, start small, scale fast, and fail cheap. I would tell you in that activity, in that particular failure, we did think big, but we forgot to start small. We thought big and we started big. And we started too big, I believe, for the constituents. It would have been far better to start small, do a few, get a little bit of success, and then go do a few more and sort of gradually march around the globe to the places that needed it the most. But instead, I thought big and I started big. We didn't go as fast as we would have wanted to, but that was okay. And certainly, I wouldn't say that it failed, but we did have to rescope it quite a bit, which was no easy feat in order to continue forward. And then it took a fair amount of energy to repair a relationship. And that is not easy to do when you have really powerful constituents. It took a lot of saying we were sorry, a lot of saying we were wrong in order to correct a relationship that today is very strong. I'm going to say that those are the leaders of the organization that have come after me that made it stronger.
What would you say lay at the root of that failure? Was it lack of humility?
Oh, perhaps so. I think that, yes, that is a great way to say it, that I was so convinced that the path I wanted to go on was right, that I didn't listen to everyone, and so I demonstrated my own lack of humility there. I would say that I combined that with a sense that certain constituents perhaps were more important than other constituents. And that allowed an imbalance in my own thinking and my own decision making to occur.
We all have heroes, for better or worse, for some reason or another. Who are your heroes? And how is it that they serve as role models?
I decided, I could probably list 100 heroes. I decided I'd narrow it down to 4 in order to give the audience a good sense of the kinds of heroes that play a role for me. And I'm going to start with 2 from a familial sense in my family, and then 2 that actually come from the 1960s. That just demonstrates my age. But they all 4, however, I believe, share certain characteristics. And the characteristics that I have that are important to me in looking for my heroes are those who have persevered against adversity, those who have beat the odds, if you will, and those who took risks because they were the right risks to take. So let me start with the first one, and I would call out my paternal grandmother. She immigrated to the United States with my paternal grandfather in the 1930s. Certainly not the best of times in the United States, worst times in Western Europe. And a few years later, my grandfather passed away. And my grandmother was left with 3 children to raise. She was French speaking as her native language. She was not all that well educated. She certainly never mastered English as a second language to the level of skill that many of us would expect today in this country. And she worked super hard in very menial jobs in order to raise 3 kids and to make it work in this country. Certainly, I believe a lot of my work ethic comes from that and was carried through in my father and his siblings. What was important to her, and she lived to be 94, so she lived many long years in this country, and I'm thrilled that she had that opportunity. But what was important to her was what we would consider to be the American dream, coming over here to give her children a better life. And in turn, they have continued that tradition to make sure that someone like me, for example, had a good education and a good start and could have a better life than my father before me. And so her courage to come over here in that situation and then to stay with it when she had no support system and was left with just 3 kids, I think puts my paternal grandmother right there. The next hero I'm going to pick is, this might be difficult, is my sister. My sister is a retired Navy reservist. She did spend 10 years active duty Air Force in her 20s. And then she went and got her degree and became an elementary school teacher. And then along the way, she started back in the Navy Reserves and recently retired from that. As a reservist, certainly you stand when the nation calls. And the nation did call her to active duty in Iraq in 2008. Do you know at the time, in 2008 when she was called, she was a 50-year-old elementary school teacher. She'd never been in a combat situation. She served in the 80s when it was a little quiet. Instead of balking and throwing down 1,000 reasons why this was not appropriate to send a 50-year-old untrained female elementary school teacher into Iraq, she stood up. And she took the training, she got combat ready as was necessary for her, and went overseas and did her time in Iraq. Her willingness to serve our nation makes her a hero to me. She is now a hero to all the elementary school children where she's now an administrator. So she has moved up in the ranks of the educational system and is there, so I make her a hero. The last 2, not because they're less important, but just in the interest of time, I'm going to sort of lump a little bit together. I mentioned that they were from the 60s. Neil Armstrong and Martin Luther King Jr. Let me start with Martin Luther King Jr. I am a product of the 60s. I am a product of the South. As might be expected, there was a fair amount of racism in the South in the 1960s, and I saw it and witnessed it a lot. My parents were very good about teaching us to disregard color as a discriminator, even though I would say sometimes their actions were not as appropriate as their words. It was segregated, obviously, at that time, but we didn't have a lot of non-white kids in school with us. When I look back at those times and I look at the risks that Martin Luther King Jr. was willing to take, and ultimately the greatest sacrifice of his life, he took them to show our America that we were not living up to the ideals of our forefathers. He took those risks to demonstrate to us that color of skin is no more a descriptor of an individual than eye color, height, weight, hair color, etc. I shudder, actually, to think where we might be today had he not been so enigmatic and so dedicated to changing our views of this nation. So I put him there. Speaking of adversity and standing in the face of the odds. Similarly, I'd put Neil Armstrong and all the early astronauts, not trying to offend any current astronauts, but all the early astronauts in the category of accepting risk and taking the call when the nation pushed it out there. I give a lot of credit to our leaders at the time who thought exploration of space was important and necessary, but I have great respect for the astronauts who would put themselves in a capsule. I don't know if you've seen some of the early ones that they went in.
Oh, yes.
It's very scary. and allow us to shoot them up to an unknown environment, to face unknown odds, and do it willingly. And certainly the advantages and the gains that we've had from a science perspective because of that are tremendous, and I put them in my hero category. So I will come back to where I began. I believe that they all represent the willingness to persevere in times of adversity, to take risks and be willing to take the risks that are necessary for forward progress and achievement, as well as to stand against the odds.
Well, that's quite a roster of heroes, for starters.
For starters, yes.
Well, Jill, thank you very much for your service to government and for giving us your insight and perspective on leadership. We appreciate your support, and good luck on all your endeavors.
Thank you. Thanks, Bob, and thanks to AFCEA for giving me the opportunity to talk.
Well, you're very welcome, and thank you. I'm Bob Ackerman, and you've been watching the AFCEA Leadership Forum 5-Question Series.